Story 1. The Loop on Highway 50. Robert Hayes had been driving 18-wheelers across America for 23 years, accumulating over 2 million miles without a single accident. He knew every major highway, every reliable truck stop, and every shortcut worth taking. His Kenworth W900 was his second home, equipped with a custom sleeper cab, satellite radio, and the latest GPS technology. In May of 2023, Robert accepted what seemed like a routine haul, delivering auto parts from Sacramento to a distribution center outside of Denver. The route would take him along Interstate 80 through Nevada and into Utah before connecting to Interstate 70. Simple, straightforward, and lucrative. Robert departed Sacramento at 4 in the afternoon, planning to drive through the night and arrive in Denver by late morning. The first few hours passed uneventfully as he crossed into Nevada, the landscape transitioning from California's agricultural valleys to the desert emptiness of the Great Basin. Around 9 p.m., as he approached the junction where he'd typically merge onto Highway 50, the loneliest road in America, his GPS suddenly recalculated, suggesting an alternate route that would save him 40 minutes. The detour directed him onto a state highway he'd never noticed before, labeled as Route 375B on his GPS display. Robert was familiar with Route 375, the famous extraterrestrial highway near Area 51, but this variation wasn't one he recognized. Still, the GPS was usually reliable, and 40 minutes meant he could make an extra fuel stop without falling behind schedule. He took the exit, following the ramp onto a 2-lane road that cut through absolute darkness, no towns visible in any direction, just his headlights illuminating cracked asphalt and faded yellow lines. The road was rougher than he expected for a state highway, with potholes that forced him to reduce speed. His CB radio crackled with static, which wasn't unusual in remote areas, but the static had a rhythm to it, almost like a heartbeat. Robert adjusted the squelch and tried reaching out on Channel 19. "This is Nighthawk. Anybody out there on 375 Bravo? Looking for road conditions ahead?" Only static answered him. After 30 minutes on the detour, Robert noticed something odd. His odometer showed he'd traveled 28 miles, but the GPS indicated he'd only covered 8 miles from the exit. He tapped the screen, thinking it had frozen, but the display was updating normally, showing his position moving along the blue route line. The discrepancy made no sense. Either his odometer was malfunctioning, which had never happened in the 5 years he'd owned this truck, or the GPS was calculating distance incorrectly. Then he saw the sign, illuminated briefly in his headlights. Ashwood, 15 miles. Robert didn't recognize the town name, which was strange because he prided himself on knowing even the smallest communities along his regular routes. 15 miles later, according to his odometer, he saw another sign. Ashwood, 15 miles. Identical placement, identical font, as if he'd somehow traveled in a circle and returned to the first sign. But that was impossible. The road had been perfectly straight, no turns, no intersections. Robert's unease deepened. He checked his fuel gauge, 3/4 full, no problem there. He tried his cell phone, but it showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given the remoteness. The CB continued its rhythmic static. He decided to trust his odometer and keep driving, figuring the GPS was glitching and the signs were just coincidentally placed. But every 15 miles, according to his odometer, the same sign appeared. Ashwood, 15 miles. After the 4th repetition, Robert pulled over, heart pounding. He grabbed his logbook and checked the time. It was now 10:45 p.m., which meant he'd been on this detour for an hour and 45 minutes. At an average speed of 40 miles per hour on the rough road, he should have covered 70 miles, yet the GPS showed him only 18 miles from the original exit point. Robert stepped out of the cab, flashlight in hand, and examined his surroundings. The desert stretched in all directions under a moonless sky filled with more stars than seemed possible. The air was utterly still, no wind, no sound except his own breathing. He walked to the rear of the trailer, checked the tires and cargo locks, everything normal. But when he looked back at the road behind him, his blood went cold. His tire tracks were visible in the dust on the shoulder, but they didn't extend backward as they should. Instead, they appeared to begin right where his truck was parked, as if the vehicle had materialized at this spot rather than driven to it. Robert crouched down, touching the tracks with his hand, confirming they were real and fresh. He walked backward along the shoulder, searching for where his tracks should have started, but found nothing. Just undisturbed dust stretching into darkness. He climbed back into the cab, hands shaking slightly. Something was deeply wrong with this road. Robert decided to turn around to backtrack to the interstate regardless of what his GPS said. He executed a careful three-point turn, difficult with a 53-foot trailer but manageable on the empty highway. Once pointed in the opposite direction, he accelerated, determined to escape whatever spatial anomaly he'd driven into. The road behind him, now ahead, looked identical. Same cracked asphalt, same faded lines, same absolute emptiness on both sides. After 15 miles, his headlights found a sign. Ashwood, 15 miles. But he was driving in the opposite direction. The sign should have indicated increasing distance, not the same unchanging message. Robert felt panic rising in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since his first winter driving through a Montana blizzard 2 decades ago. He tried the CB again. "This is an emergency. Any trucker, any driver, anyone receiving this transmission, please respond. I'm stuck in some kind of loop on Route 375 Bravo in Nevada. GPS is malfunctioning, road signs aren't making sense. Please respond." The static pulsed, and beneath it Robert thought he heard something else. A voice, distorted and distant, speaking words he couldn't quite distinguish. He drove faster, pushing 50 miles per hour despite the road conditions, desperate to find something different, any variation in the endless repetition. His fuel gauge hadn't moved, still showing 3/4 full despite the hours of driving. That should have been impossible. His truck consumed fuel at a predictable rate, and he should have burned through at least a quarter tank by now. Then he saw lights ahead, the first illumination besides his own headlights since entering this road. A building materialized from the darkness, a truck stop, old-fashioned and run down, with a single flickering neon sign reading Ashwood Service. Robert nearly cried with relief. He pulled into the lot, noting 3 other trucks parked in a row, their cabs dark, drivers presumably sleeping. The building looked like something from the 1950s, all chrome and faded paint. Robert parked and approached the entrance, finding it unlocked. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed, casting a sickly yellow glow over empty tables and a lunch counter. Behind the counter stood a man, middle-aged and gaunt, wearing a grease-stained uniform with a name tag that read, Earl. "Help you?" Earl asked, his voice flat and emotionless. "Yeah, thank God. I've been driving in circles for hours. My GPS is all messed up. Can you tell me how to get back to Interstate 80? Earl stared at him without blinking. "There's only one road. You're on it." "No, I mean I took an exit, a detour. I need to get back to the main highway." "There's only one road," Earl repeated, exact same inflection, exact same cadence. "You're on it." Robert felt ice in his veins. "What about those other drivers?" He pointed toward the parked trucks visible through the window. "Can I talk to them?" Earl's expression didn't change. "They're resting. They'll drive again soon. There's only one road." Robert backed toward the door. "I'm leaving. I'm getting out of here." He turned and ran to his truck, not looking back. He climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the lot, accelerating hard. In his mirror, he saw the truck stop receding, but Earl was standing in the parking lot now, watching him leave. absolutely motionless. The road continued, unchanged and unchanging. Robert drove for what felt like hours, though his clock seemed stuck, the digital display showing the same time, 10:45 p.m., no matter how long he drove. The fuel gauge remained at 3/4. The odometer continued, clicking up miles, but the GPS showed him moving in place, circling the same 8-mile segment endlessly. He passed the Ashwood sign again, and again, and again. Each time his desperation grew. He tried ramming through the desert, leaving the road entirely, but his steering wheel wouldn't turn more than a few degrees. The truck stayed locked on the highway as if on rails. He tried stopping, refusing to drive, but after sitting motionless for what felt like 20 minutes, he looked up and found himself moving again. The truck driving itself, his hands on the wheel but not controlling anything. The CB radio static resolved into words. "There's only one road. You're on it. There's only one road. You're on it." Earl's voice repeating endlessly, overlapping itself until it became a chorus of hundreds of Earls speaking in unison. Robert screamed, pounding the steering wheel, but the truck continued its endless journey along the impossible highway. He saw the other trucks now, appearing periodically in his headlights, parked on the shoulder with dark cabs. As he passed one, he glimpsed the driver through the windshield, a skeletal figure slumped over the wheel, mummified by time. Yet the truck's lights were on, engine idling. He understood then. This wasn't a road. It was a trap, a closed loop that caught drivers and kept them circling forever, burning fuel that never depleted, covering distance that didn't exist, traveling through time that refused to pass. The other trucks were from different eras. He'd seen their models ranging from 1960s Peterbilts to modern Freightliners. Each had entered the loop at different times and none had escaped. Robert drove through the night that wouldn't end, past the sign that never changed, toward the town that never arrived. His mind began to fracture, accepting the impossibility, surrendering to the endless repetition. The CB voices became comforting, a companion in the void. His reflection in the mirror started looking unfamiliar, gaunt and hollow, aging years and hours that weren't really passing. When dawn finally came, or what resembled dawn, a gray lightening of the sky that felt more like a stage effect than actual sunrise, Robert saw something new. Another truck, a modern Volvo, pulled over on the shoulder ahead. Its hazard lights were flashing. Robert stopped beside it and saw the driver climbing out, a young man, maybe 30, looking confused and frightened. "Hey man, my GPS is totally screwed up," the young driver said. "Can you help me figure out where we are?" Robert looked at him and something in his mind shifted. He heard himself speaking, but the words weren't his own. "There's only one road. You're on it." His voice was flat and emotionless, exactly like Earl's had been. The young driver's eyes widened. "What? No. I just need directions back to—" "There's only one road," Robert repeated. "You're on it." He climbed back into his cab and drove away, leaving the young driver standing on the shoulder, calling after him. In his mirror, Robert saw the man's truck fall in behind him, joining the procession of vehicles circling the loop, another traveler caught in the highway that existed outside of space and time. Robert Hayes continues driving. The GPS shows 8 miles traveled endlessly. The odometer accumulates meaningless distance. The fuel gauge never moves, and every 15 miles the sign appears. Ashwood, 15 miles. He's been driving for 23 years, or maybe 23 hours, or maybe 23 minutes. Time has become as meaningless as distance on the road that has no beginning and no end. The loop on Highway 50 that catches truckers and keeps them forever. Circling through darkness, passing signs that promise arrival at a destination that exists only as a perpetually deferred future. Always 15 miles ahead, never 1 mile closer. Story 2. The Cargo from Warehouse 9. Patricia Sullivan had worked as an independent trucker for 16 years, specializing in hazardous materials transport. Her credentials included every certification required for hauling chemicals, flammable materials, and radioactive substances. In September of 2022, she received a job offer that paid triple her usual rate, a single overnight haul from a facility outside of Oak Ridge, Tennessee, to a government warehouse in Nevada. The cargo manifest was vague, listed only as experimental materials requiring secure transport, but the premium payment and the legitimate government contract numbers checked out. Patricia accepted. She arrived at the Oak Ridge facility at 6 p.m., presenting her credentials at a security checkpoint that seemed more appropriate for a military base than a warehouse. Armed guards checked her documentation thoroughly before directing her to Loading Dock 9, located at the facility's rear, isolated from other operations. As she backed her freight liner Cascadia to the dock, Patricia noticed the unusual silence. No workers visible, no forklifts moving, just empty pavement under harsh security lights. Two men in unmarked uniforms met her, both wearing respirators despite being outdoors. They handed her a sealed envelope. "Your route instructions and special protocols," one said, his voice muffled. "Do not open the cargo container under any circumstances. Do not deviate from the specified route. Do not stop except at designated fuel stations. Maintain speed between 60 and 70 miles per hour at all times. Do you understand?" Patricia nodded, taking the envelope. "What exactly am I hauling?" "That information is classified. The container is sealed and shielded. You're in no danger provided you follow protocols exactly." The men loaded a container onto her flatbed trailer, a metal box approximately 20 feet long, windowless, covered in warning symbols Patricia didn't recognize. The container was secured with locks that required both a physical key and an electronic code to open. Once loaded, Patricia signed the documentation and departed, opening the envelope once she'd cleared the facility. Inside were detailed route instructions that avoided all major highways, directing her instead along rural routes through Tennessee, Arkansas, Oklahoma, and into Nevada. Estimated travel time was 36 hours with fuel stops at 3 specific locations: a truck stop outside of Memphis, another near Oklahoma City, and a third in rural New Mexico. Each stop was marked with precise GPS coordinates. The first hours passed uneventfully as Patricia drove through the Tennessee night, following the winding route through small towns and empty farmland. Her CB radio was silent, which wasn't surprising given the remote areas. Around midnight, as she crossed into Arkansas, she noticed something odd in her mirrors. The container was glowing faintly, a greenish luminescence visible through seams and rivets. The light pulsed slowly like breathing. Patricia's training kicked in. If hazardous cargo was leaking or showing signs of instability, protocol required immediate reporting. She reached for her phone to call the emergency number provided in the instructions, but her phone showed no signal despite being in an area that should have had coverage. She tried her CB radio. "This is Patricia Sullivan, independent hauler transporting government cargo. I'm observing unusual luminescence from sealed container. Requesting immediate guidance." Static answered, but beneath it Patricia heard something else. A sound like whispering, multiple voices speaking in overlapping fragments. She couldn't distinguish words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. She adjusted the squelch, trying to clear the interference, but the whispering intensified. Then her truck's dashboard lights flickered, all of them simultaneously dimming and brightening in rhythm with the container's pulsing glow. Patricia checked her gauges. Everything showed normal, but the synchronized pulsing continued. Her engine temperature gauge rose slightly, then fell, rose and fell, matching the pulse. It was as if the cargo was somehow interfacing with her truck's electrical system. She pulled over at the first fuel stop, the one outside of Memphis, arriving at 2:15 a.m. The station was small and isolated with only 2 pumps under a flickering canopy. A single clerk was visible through the window of the attached convenience store, but he wasn't moving, just standing behind the counter staring at nothing. Patricia fueled up quickly, her skin crawling with unease. The container's glow had dimmed but not disappeared. As she finished fueling, she walked to the rear of her trailer to visually inspect the cargo. The container sat motionless, but the metal surface was warm to the touch despite the cool night air. Patricia pressed her hand against it and felt vibration, subtle but unmistakable, like a heartbeat. She jerked her hand back and returned to the cab, deciding to continue despite her growing fear. The job paid too well to abandon without concrete reason, and nothing in her training indicated that luminescence alone constituted an emergency. Perhaps it was a normal property of whatever exotic material she was transporting. As she drove through Arkansas into Oklahoma, the whispering on the CB radio grew clearer. Patricia could now distinguish individual words, though they made no coherent sense. Not stable. Containment failing. Need to warn. 8 subjects. Don't let it reach. The voices sounded desperate, frightened. She tried responding. Who is this? Please identify yourself. Are you trying to reach me? A new voice cut through the static, cold and mechanical. Maintain course, do not deviate. Ignore extraneous communications. Arrival at destination is imperative. The voice had no human quality to it. It sounded synthesized, generated by a machine. Patricia's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Something was very wrong with this cargo, and the whispering voices seemed to be trying to warn her. But warn her about what? She reviewed the protocols again. Maintain speed, don't open the container, don't deviate from route. Nothing about luminescence, nothing about strange radio transmissions, nothing about what to do if the cargo seemed to be alive. Because that's what it felt like. The container didn't feel like it held inanimate experimental materials. It felt like it held something living, something aware. Patricia had hauled livestock before, horses, cattle, and she recognized the sensation of transporting something that breathed and moved and possessed its own will. The container gave her that same feeling, magnified and distorted into something deeply unnatural. At the Oklahoma City fuel stop, Patricia made a decision. She would inspect the cargo more thoroughly, rules be damned. She parked away from the pumps in a dark corner of the lot and approached the container with a flashlight. The glow had intensified, now bright enough to cast green light across the pavement. Patricia walked around the container, examining every surface. On the container's rear door, she found a small viewing port she'd missed earlier, covered by a sliding panel. Her training and common sense screamed at her not to open it, but her need to know overpowered caution. She slid the panel aside and peered through the small window into the container's interior. What she saw would haunt her forever. The container held 8 vertical tubes, each containing a human figure suspended in clear fluid. The figures were naked, hairless, their skin pale and veins visible beneath the surface. They weren't quite human. Their proportions were slightly wrong, limbs too long, heads too large. And their eyes were open, all 16 eyes staring directly at her through the viewing port. Their mouths moved, in unison, forming words she couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help us, please, we're aware. We're trapped. Patricia stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the pavement. She stood there, breathing hard, mind racing. This wasn't experimental materials, this was people, or something like people being transported against their will. The whispering on the CB made horrible sense now. It wasn't random interference. It was the beings in the container, somehow projecting their voices through electromagnetic signals, desperately trying to communicate. She ran to her cab and grabbed her phone. Signal or no signal, determined to call someone, anyone. But before she could dial, headlights illuminated her. Two black SUVs pulling into the lot, parking on either side of her truck, boxing her in. Men in dark suits emerged, not threatening her physically, but making their presence and intent clear. One approached Patricia, holding out credentials identifying him as a Department of Energy security officer. "Ms. Sullivan, we're tracking your cargo remotely. The container is equipped with GPS and telemetry. We're aware you opened the viewing port. That was a violation of protocol." "Those are people in there," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "You're transporting people in sealed containers. That's kidnapping or worse." The officer's expression remained neutral. "The subjects in that container are not classified as persons under current legal frameworks. They're experimental organisms created in a laboratory, never born, possessing no rights under law. Your job is to transport them, nothing more. We strongly recommend you continue to your destination without further deviation. And if I refuse, then we'll commandeer your vehicle. You'll be detained for violation of security protocols, and you'll face criminal charges under federal national security statutes. You signed an NDA as part of accepting this job. You're bound by it." Patricia felt trapped. She could refuse, abandon the job, potentially face prosecution. Or she could continue knowing she was complicit in transporting sentient beings to an unknown fate. The beings in the container, whatever they were aware and suffering. But what could she do against federal agents and the weight of government secrecy? The officer seemed to read her thoughts. "For what it's worth, they're not going to be harmed. They're being transferred to a more suitable containment facility where their needs can be better met. The urgency is because their current containment is failing. If we don't complete this transfer, they'll die. You're actually saving them by continuing." Patricia wanted to believe him, needed to believe that she wasn't participating in something monstrous. She nodded slowly. "I'll continue, but I want it on record that I was coerced, that I objected to the conditions I observed." "Your objection is noted." The officer handed her a document to sign, acknowledging the conversation. Then the SUVs departed, leaving Patricia alone with her cargo and her conscience. She drove through the remaining night and into the next day. The beings whispered pleas constant on her CB radio. She tried talking to them, explaining that she was just the driver, that she didn't have the authority to free them. The whispers changed tone, becoming less desperate, more resigned. They told her their story in fragments. Created in a laboratory as biological experiments, designed to possess enhanced cognitive abilities, self-aware from the moment of consciousness, treated as property rather than people, tested and studied for years, now being moved because the facility was closing. Patricia asked the question she dreaded. What happens at the destination? What will they do to you? The whispers fell silent for a long moment. Then, "They'll extract our neural tissue, study our brain structure, dissection. We'll be conscious through it. They say our pain responses provide valuable data." Patricia nearly drove off the road. "That's torture. That's murder. We're not legally alive. We have no standing to claim otherwise. You're our only hope. Please." But what could she do? She was one person against a vast government apparatus. If she tried to free them, she'd be caught, arrested, and the beings would still end up at their destination. If she tried to go public, her NDA and national security restrictions would silence her before the story gained traction. She felt helpless, trapped in a moral nightmare with no good options. As she approached the final fuel stop in New Mexico, Patricia made her decision. She pulled off the route, deviating from the specified path, and drove instead toward the nearest hospital. If the beings were suffering from containment failure, as the officer claimed, medical personnel could provide aid. She'd claim ignorance of the cargo's nature, play the innocent driver following humanitarian instincts. But her truck wouldn't respond to steering input. The wheel turned, but the vehicle stayed locked on the original route, as if the GPS was controlling the physical steering system. Patricia tried braking, but the brakes didn't engage. She tried shifting into neutral, but the transmission was locked. Her truck had been compromised, remotely controlled, ensuring she couldn't deviate regardless of her intentions. She arrived at the Nevada facility at dawn, a vast complex in the desert surrounded by fencing and guard towers. Personnel unloaded the container efficiently, disconnecting it from her trailer and moving it on a specialized vehicle toward an interior building. Patricia watched from her cab, feeling like she'd failed some fundamental test of humanity. The payment appeared in her account within an hour, triple the normal rate as promised. She signed the completion documentation, received clearance to depart, and drove away from the facility, empty trailer rattling behind her. The CB radio was silent now. The being's whispers had stopped, and Patricia knew why. They'd reached their destination. Their brief hope of rescue had ended. Patricia Sullivan never accepted another government contract. She couldn't. The memory of those 16 eyes staring at her, pleading silently, haunts her still. She tried to investigate to find out what happened to the 8 beings she transported, but every inquiry hit classified barriers. The facility she delivered to doesn't officially exist. The cargo manifest has been sealed under national security restrictions. She still drives, still hauls cargo across America, but she's changed. She can't look at sealed containers without wondering what's inside, whether something aware and suffering is being transported as mere property. She hears whispers sometimes on her CB radio, fragments of desperate voices, and she doesn't know if they're real or if her guilt has created permanent hallucinations. Patricia knows the truth that most people don't. There are things being moved through America's highways in the darkness, things that shouldn't exist according to public knowledge, things that are aware and afraid and helpless. And truckers like her are the unwitting accomplices, just trying to make a living, following orders, transporting horror from one black site to another while the beings inside beg for mercy that never comes. Whisper pleas that go unanswered, trapped in metal boxes rolling through the night toward fates worse than death. And there's nothing anyone can do because officially, legally, they don't exist. They're not people. They're just cargo property, experimental materials to be delivered on schedule, regardless of their suffering, regardless of their awareness, regardless of their desperate, futile hope for rescue. Story 3. The Hitchhiker on Route 285. Daniel Ortega had been trucking for 19 years, primarily hauling refrigerated goods across the Southwest. He knew every mile of highway between El Paso and Albuquerque, could navigate the routes half asleep, and prided himself on never being late with a delivery. In November of 2023, Daniel was returning empty from Albuquerque to El Paso along Route 285, a lonely 2-lane highway that cut through the desolate New Mexico landscape. It was just past midnight, his headlights the only illumination for miles, when he saw the figure on the shoulder. A woman stood beside the road, thumb out in the universal gesture of hitchhiking. She wore a light summer dress despite the November cold, and her dark hair blew in the wind. Daniel's CB radio crackled as he approached her, and a voice, male, urgent, spoke through the static. "Don't pick her up. Whatever you do, don't stop." The voice cut out before Daniel could respond. He slowed, his trucker's code of helping stranded travelers warring with the mysterious warning. The woman looked desperate, waving her arms as his truck approached. Against his better judgment, Daniel pulled over. She ran to the passenger door, and he leaned across to open it. "Thank God," she said, climbing in. "I've been stuck out here for hours. My car broke down and my phone's dead. Can you give me a ride to the next town?" "Sure," Daniel said, putting the truck in gear. "You must be freezing in that dress." She smiled, settling into the seat. "I'm fine. I don't really feel the cold anymore." Her voice had an odd quality, slightly off in pitch, as if she was speaking from the bottom of a well. They drove in silence for a few minutes, Daniel checking his mirrors habitually. The woman sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. "I'm Daniel," he offered, trying to make conversation. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she replied without looking at him. "Sarah Dennison." "What were you doing out there in the middle of nowhere?" "Driving, always driving. I've been driving these roads for a long time now." Her answer made no sense. She'd said her car broke down, but now she was talking like she'd been driving continuously. Daniel glanced at her, noticing something wrong with her appearance. Her dress wasn't just summery, it was vintage, styled like something from the 1960s, and her face, which he'd initially thought young, had a strange quality to it, like a photograph slightly out of focus. His CB crackled again. "You picked her up, didn't you, you stupid bastard? You need to stop the truck right now and make her get out. She's not what she seems." Different voice this time, also male, also urgent. "Who's that?" Sarah asked, turning her head toward the radio. When she moved, Daniel caught a whiff of something awful. Decay, rot, death. "Just CB chatter," he said, his hands tightening on the wheel. "Sarah, where exactly do you need to go?" "To the end. To where the road ends. We all have to reach it eventually." She was still staring straight ahead, and Daniel realized she wasn't blinking. Her eyes were open, fixed, glassy. Like a corpse's eyes. Daniel's heart rate accelerated. Something was very wrong. He needed to get this woman, this thing, out of his truck. "Listen, I just remembered I have to stop and check my cargo. Refrigeration system's been acting up. I'll pull over, you can wait in the cab while I—" "You don't have cargo," Sarah interrupted, her voice now completely flat. "Your trailer's empty. You're lying because you're afraid. You should be afraid." The temperature in the cab dropped precipitously. Daniel could see his breath now crystallizing in the air. Sarah's skin began to change, becoming pale and waxy, her lips turning blue. "I died on this road in 1967, she said. "July 14th. I was 23 years old, driving to see my fiancée in El Paso. A truck came around the curve too fast, crossed the center line, hit me head on. I died instantly, but something went wrong. I didn't. Move on. I've been here on this highway for 56 years. Every night I try to reach the end of the road. Every night I fail. And now you're going to help me." Daniel tried the door handle, but it wouldn't open. He tried the window controls. Dead. His steering wheel locked, and the truck continued forward at steady speed, 55 miles per hour, heading south on Route 285. Sarah's hand reached out and touched his arm, and where her fingers made contact, his skin burned with cold so intense it felt like fire. "I've hitchhiked with 73 drivers," Sarah continued, her voice gaining emotion, anger, frustration, desperation. "Some of them fought, some of them accepted. All of them helped me travel a little further down the road, closer to the end. But it's never enough. The road keeps going, and I keep needing to reach its end." "What happens to the drivers?" Daniel managed to ask through chattering teeth. "They become like me, trapped on the highway, trying to reach destinations that don't exist. You'll see them eventually. You'll recognize them. They'll be the ones who pick up hitchhikers, who try to warn others on the CB, who desperately attempt to break the cycle even though they're part of it now." Daniel understood then. The warnings on his CB weren't from living truckers, they were from previous victims trapped in the same loop, trying to prevent others from making their mistake. And he'd ignored them, stopped anyway, doomed himself to the same fate. The highway stretched endlessly before them, and Daniel knew with horrible certainty that it would never end. That he'd drive forever through this cold night with Sarah beside him, her dead hand on his arm, draining the life from him mile by mile until he became another ghost on Route 285, another warning voice on the CB that no one would heed, another driver trying to reach an end that didn't exist, That couldn't exist, because hell wasn't a place of fire and demons. It was an endless highway through darkness with death riding shotgun, whispering about destinations that retreated with every mile traveled, forever out of reach. Story 4. The facility that wasn't there. Marcus Webb had driven for 12 years, specializing in less than truckload freight, picking up and delivering multiple shipments along complex routes. In March of 2024, his dispatch sent him an unusual delivery: a single pallet of unmarked crates to be delivered to a facility in rural Montana. The address existed on his GPS, the delivery authorization checked out, and the pay was reasonable. Marcus loaded the pallet at a warehouse in Spokane and headed east into Montana's empty spaces. The GPS directed him off Interstate 90 onto increasingly remote roads, eventually guiding him down a gravel track that wound through dense forest. After 20 miles, the trees opened onto a clearing containing a large concrete building with no windows and no signs. A loading dock stood empty, a single rolling door closed. Marcus backed his truck to the dock and honked, waiting for someone to emerge. No one came. He honked again, checked his phone. No signal as expected in this remote location. He climbed out and approached a door beside the dock, finding it unlocked. "Hello? Delivery for..." He checked his paperwork. No company name, just an address and a reference number. "Delivery for reference number 773 Alpha." The interior was a long corridor, fluorescent lights humming, no decoration, no signs, just concrete walls and tile floors. Marcus walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing, calling out periodically but receiving no answer. He passed several doors, all closed, all unmarked. At the corridor's end, he found an office with a window looking into the hallway. A man sat at the desk inside, writing in a ledger. He looked up as Marcus approached. "Delivery?" the man asked. "Yeah, reference 773 Alpha. 1 pallet. Where do you want it?" The man consulted his ledger. "Dock 3. Back your truck around to the north side." Marcus returned to his truck and drove around the building, finding a second loading dock on the north side. He backed in, and this time, workers appeared. 3 men in identical gray coveralls moving in perfect synchronization. They unloaded the pallet without speaking, working with eerie efficiency. Marcus had them sign the delivery confirmation, and they disappeared back into the building without a word. As Marcus prepared to leave, he noticed something odd. His truck's clock showed 3:15 p.m., but his watch showed 10:45 a.m. A 5-hour discrepancy. He checked his phone. Dead, battery completely drained despite being fully charged when he arrived. His GPS was rebooting continuously, unable to acquire satellites. He drove back down the gravel road, but it seemed different now. Trees in different positions, curves where there should have been straightaways. After 30 minutes, he emerged onto a paved road, but not the one he'd entered from. The landscape was wrong, too flat, lacking the mountains that should have been visible. Marcus drove until he found a town, pulling into a gas station to get his bearings. The attendant looked at him strangely when he asked where he was. "You're in Hardin, Montana. Where'd you think you were?" "Hardin?" Marcus pulled out his map. Hardin was 200 miles southeast of where he should have been. "That's impossible. I was delivering in the northwest part of the state." "Well, you're here now," the attendant said, shrugging. Marcus checked his GPS. It now showed Hardin correctly, as if he'd driven there normally. But his fuel gauge showed he'd burned only a quarter tank, nowhere near enough to have covered 200 miles. His odometer showed he'd traveled 38 miles since the delivery, which matched the distance to Hardin from... where? The facility he'd delivered to? He tried to retrace his route, but the gravel road was gone. He drove for hours, searching for the turnoff, finding nothing. Eventually, he gave up and continued to his next scheduled pickup, writing off the experience as disorientation from poor sleep. But the oddities continued. His logbook showed the delivery taking place at 10 a.m., arriving in Hardin at 11 a.m., a 1-hour interval instead of the 5+ hours he'd actually experienced. His electronic logging device showed the same impossible timeline. And when he tried to contact dispatch about the facility, they had no record of the delivery. No reference number 773 Alpha, no paperwork except what Marcus had in his possession, which the office claimed was a forgery, not matching their documentation formats. Marcus became obsessed with finding the facility again. On subsequent runs through Montana, he'd deviate from routes, exploring back roads, searching for the building. He never found it. He contacted the company that had supposedly sent the shipment. They'd never heard of him, had no facility in Montana, insisted he'd never made a delivery for them. His wife suggested he see a doctor, worried he'd experienced a stroke or seizure causing false memories. But Marcus knew what he'd experienced was real. He had the signed delivery confirmation, had the memory of every detail. The facility existed, or had existed, or existed in some way that didn't align with normal geography. Then he started seeing the same workers. The 3 men in gray coveralls who'd unloaded his truck. He saw them at a rest stop in Wyoming, standing together, perfectly still, watching him. He saw them at a truck stop in Idaho, sitting at a table, not eating, not talking, just sitting in absolute synchronization. He saw them at a way station in Washington, standing beside a state trooper's car, watching every truck that passed. They never approached him, never acknowledged him, but their presence was unmistakable. And Marcus understood that he'd delivered something to somewhere that wasn't supposed to be accessible, that existed between normal places, and now he was marked. Noticeable to the things that moved between dimensions, visible to the workers who staffed facilities that didn't exist on any map. Marcus quit trucking last year. He couldn't handle seeing the gray coveralled men everywhere, couldn't shake the feeling that one day they'd approach him, hand him another delivery authorization, send him to another impossible facility from which he might not return. He works warehouse jobs now, never traveling, staying close to home. But sometimes he dreams of the corridor with humming lights, of the office with the man writing in the ledger, of the facility that swallowed 5 hours of his life and relocated him 200 miles from where he should have been. And he wonders what he actually delivered, what purpose that facility served, and whether anyone else has found it, or if he's the only person alive who remembers it existed at all. Story 5. The Convoy That Disappeared. Jennifer Martinez had worked as a long-haul trucker for 14 years, frequently running team operations with her partner driver and husband, Luis. In August of 2023, they joined a 4-truck convoy hauling construction equipment from Houston to Seattle. Convoys weren't common in modern trucking, but this particular haul involved oversized loads requiring coordination, and the company thought it safer to have multiple drivers traveling together. The convoy consisted of Jennifer and Luis in the lead truck, followed by 3 other drivers, Robert Hayes, Patricia Sullivan, and Thomas Chen. They departed Houston at 6 a.m., planning to take Interstate 10 west through Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, then north through Nevada and into Washington. The first 2 days passed uneventfully, the convoy maintaining formation, communicating via CB radio, stopping together for fuel and rest. They were good colleagues, experienced drivers who'd worked with each other before, comfortable with the rhythm of long-distance hauling. On the 3rd day, crossing Nevada along a desolate stretch of Interstate 80, something changed. Jennifer was driving while Luis slept in the cab behind her. The time was approximately 3 p.m., the desert stretching endlessly in all directions under brutal sun. She glanced in her mirror and noticed the second truck, Robert's, was no longer visible. Strange, because he should have been only a quarter mile behind, clearly visible on the flat, straight highway. She grabbed the CB, Robert, you back there? You falling behind? Static answered. She tried again. Robert, Patricia, Thomas, anyone copy? Luis woke up, sensing something wrong. What's going on? I lost visual on the others. CB's not working. Jennifer checked her mirrors again. The highway behind was completely empty. No trucks visible to the horizon. They pulled over at the next exit, a rest area that consisted of nothing but a few parking spaces and a picnic table in the middle of nowhere. They waited for 30 minutes, expecting the other trucks to catch up, but none appeared. Jennifer tried her cell phone. No signal. She tried the CB on multiple channels. Nothing but static. This doesn't make sense, Luis said. They were right behind us. Where could they have gone? They got back on the highway, continuing west, assuming the others would catch up eventually. But as miles passed, Jennifer began noticing other oddities. The highway markers showed they were on Interstate 80, but the landscape looked wrong. Different mountains in the distance, vegetation that didn't match Nevada's typical desert flora. The sun was in the wrong position, too far north for August. They reached the next town. According to signs, it was called Millerton. But Jennifer had driven this route dozens of times and had never seen a town by that name. They exited, looking for a place to call their dispatcher, and found a main street that looked like a movie set from the 1950s. The cars parked along the street were vintage models, perfectly maintained. The storefronts had old-fashioned signage and displayed goods in windows like museum pieces. A few people walked the sidewalks, all dressed in styles from decades past. Jennifer and Luis parked their truck and approached a man standing outside what appeared to be a general store. "Excuse me, can you tell us where we are?" The man looked at them with confusion. "Millerton, Nevada. Where else would we be? Is there a phone we can use? Our cell phones aren't working." The man pointed to the store. "Phone's inside." His expression was peculiar, as if he'd never heard of cell phones. Inside the store, they found a rotary phone mounted on the wall. Jennifer tried to call dispatch but couldn't get a signal, just clicking and humming on the line. The shopkeeper, an elderly woman behind the counter, watched them with interest. "Having trouble?" "Yeah, we can't seem to reach anyone." "What year is it?" The question sounded absurd even as Jennifer asked it, but she needed to know. 1958. Why would you ask such a strange question? Jennifer and Luis exchanged looks of pure panic. They thanked the woman and hurried back to their truck. "This is impossible," Luis said. "We're in some kind of time pocket, alternate dimension? This can't be real." They drove out of Millerton back onto the highway, desperate to escape whatever anomaly they'd entered. But the highway seemed to loop. They drove for an hour and found themselves entering Millerton again from a different direction. The same vintage cars, the same people on sidewalks, the same shopkeeper looking at them with renewed confusion as they passed through town. On the third loop, they saw another truck, a 1950s-era semi, pulling into a gas station. Jennifer stopped beside it and the driver climbed out. A man in his 50s wearing clothes from that era. "You folks look lost," he said. "We're trying to get to Seattle," Jennifer replied. "But we keep ending up back in this town." The man nodded knowingly. "It happens. You drove through something, didn't you? A shimmer in the air, a place where the heat waves looked wrong." Maybe?" Jennifer tried to remember. There had been a section of highway where the air seemed distorted, but she'd attributed it to heat mirages. "That's the threshold," the man said. "It moves around, catches drivers sometimes. Been here myself for 6 years now. Can't find a way back to my own time. There are others too scattered around. We're all stuck in this loop, this pocket of time that doesn't connect to the real world." "There has to be a way out," Luis insisted. "If there is, I haven't found it." Best advice I can give. Don't drive at night. That's when the things come out, the things that maintain this place, that feed on the time we're losing. Stay in town after dark. Find somewhere safe. Some of us have survived by following that rule. Jennifer refused to accept this. She and Luis drove through the night, ignoring the man's warning, determined to break free. As darkness fell, they saw things on the highway. Shapes that resembled vehicles but moved wrong, flickering in and out of visibility. Other trucks from other eras, all caught in the same trap, all trying to escape. And they saw their convoy partners. Robert's truck appeared ahead of them, driving normally. Jennifer accelerated to catch up, flashing her lights. Robert's truck responded, slowing down. They pulled alongside, and Jennifer saw Robert in the driver's seat, but his face was wrong, aged decades in the 3 hours since she'd last seen him. His hair white, his skin wrinkled. He looked at her and mouthed words she couldn't hear. "Go back. Don't end up like me." His truck accelerated, pulling ahead, then simply vanished as if it had never existed. Jennifer slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt. She and Luis sat in silence, processing what they'd witnessed. "We have to find the threshold," Jennifer finally said. "The place where we entered. If we can get back through it from the other side, maybe we can escape." They drove through the remainder of the night, searching for the shimmer the man had described. As dawn broke, they found it, a section of highway where the air looked wrong, distorting like a lens. Jennifer aimed directly at it, accelerating, praying this would work. The truck passed through, and for a moment everything went white. Then they were on normal highway, normal Nevada landscape with normal traffic. Jennifer's phone suddenly buzzed with dozens of notifications, messages from dispatch, from their kids, from other drivers, all time-stamped over the past 3 hours. They pulled over, shaking. According to the clock, only 3 hours had passed since they'd lost sight of the other trucks. But they'd experienced what felt like a full day in the time pocket, had aged emotionally if not physically from the ordeal. The other 3 trucks were never found. Robert Hayes, Patricia Sullivan, and Thomas Chen disappeared from Interstate 80 in Nevada on August 15, 2023. Their trucks, their cargo, their bodies, all gone without a trace. The official investigation found no evidence of accident or foul play. They simply ceased to exist on that stretch of highway. Jennifer and Luis never ran that route again. They transferred to East Coast operations, where the highways feel safer, more solid, less likely to split open and swallow drivers into pockets of lost time. But they know what happened to their convoy partners. Know they're still out there, trapped in loops of highway that exist between moments, driving forever through manufactured towns in decades that aren't real, aging and suffering while trying desperately to find the threshold back to their own timeline. Back to families that will eventually stop looking for them. Back to a world that has already forgotten they existed. Story 6. The Truck That Drove Itself. Antonio Silva had worked in trucking for 21 years, but in October of 2023 he faced a problem he'd never encountered. His truck apparently made a delivery without him. According to his electronic logging device, his GPS records, and his company's tracking system, his Peterbilt 579 had traveled from Sacramento to a warehouse in Reno, delivered its cargo, and returned to Sacramento, all while Antonio was asleep in his apartment in Sacramento, having taken a scheduled day off. The anomaly came to light when dispatch called him, confused. "Antonio, we show you completed the Reno run yesterday, but you didn't log into the system or file paperwork. What's going on?" "I didn't drive yesterday, I was off." "That's impossible." But the data was clear. His truck's GPS showed the complete route, including stops for fuel, rest breaks, way station checks. Security camera footage from the Reno warehouse showed his truck arriving at the correct time, backing into the loading dock, and departing after cargo was unloaded. The time logs matched a normal delivery perfectly. Antonio went to the company yard and inspected his truck. The odometer had increased by exactly the number of miles required for the Sacramento-Reno round trip. The fuel level had dropped appropriately. The truck's engine was warm, indicating recent use. And sitting in the cab, he found a receipt from a fuel stop in Truckee, time-stamped during the drive he hadn't made, along with a coffee cup he'd never purchased, still containing residue. Most disturbing was the video from his truck's dash cam. The system recorded continuously, and when Antonio reviewed the footage, he saw the cab from the dashboard camera's perspective. But the driver's seat was empty. The truck drove itself along the highway, executed lane changes, merged into traffic, responded to road conditions, all without any visible operator. The steering wheel turned on its own, guided by invisible hands. The truck stopped for fuel and the pump activated despite no one being present to operate it. At the warehouse, the footage showed his truck backing into the dock with precision. Workers unloading cargo, one of them glancing into the cab and then looking away quickly, as if he'd seen something that disturbed him but chose not to investigate. The truck departed, drove back to Sacramento and parked itself in the company yard. Antonio showed the footage to his dispatcher, who called in the company's safety director. They reviewed everything together. "This is a major security breach," the director said. "Someone must have hacked your truck's systems, operated it remotely. We'll need to report this to the manufacturer and the authorities." But further investigation revealed no evidence of hacking. The truck's systems showed no external access, no unauthorized connections. The vehicle had operated using Antonio's own access codes, his own biometric authentication, as if he'd been present even though he verifiably hadn't been. Then Antonio found the logbook, not his official electronic log, but a handwritten journal in the truck's glove compartment in his own handwriting. The entries described the Reno run in detail, noting road conditions, fuel stops, delivery confirmation. The handwriting was identical to his. Every quirk and flourish matched perfectly. But Antonio had no memory of writing it, had been nowhere near his truck when these entries were supposedly made. The journal contained other entries too, dating back months, describing deliveries Antonio didn't remember making but which his systems confirmed had occurred. Runs he'd apparently completed while he was actually elsewhere, living his life, completely unaware that his truck was operating autonomously or that some duplicate version of himself was driving it. Antonio began investigating his own history, checking records meticulously. He found dozens of discrepancies, deliveries his company showed him completing but which he had no memory of, times when his truck's location and his phone's location were hundreds of miles apart, fuel expenses for trips he never took. It was as if two Antonio Silvas existed simultaneously, the one who lived in Sacramento, spent time with his family, took days off, and another one who drove continuously, never stopped working, completed runs with perfect efficiency. He decided to confront the phenomenon directly. He installed hidden cameras in his truck, positioned to capture the driver's seat from multiple angles. Then he took another scheduled day off, staying home but monitoring the cameras remotely via cellular connection. At 6 a.m., his truck's engine started in the company yard. The cameras showed the driver's seat empty as the truck navigated out of the lot and onto city streets. But then gradually a figure began to appear, translucent at first, then solidifying. It was Antonio himself, or something that looked exactly like him, wearing his usual driving clothes, operating the controls with his mannerisms and habits. The duplicate Antonio drove to a pickup location, loaded cargo, and began a run to Portland. Antonio watched from his apartment, seeing himself in two places simultaneously. When his wife asked what he was doing, he couldn't explain, just showed her the camera feed. She went pale. "That's you." "How is that you?" The duplicate completed the Portland run over 2 days, performing all tasks exactly as Antonio would have, then returned the truck to Sacramento and parked it. As the engine shut off, the duplicate began to fade, becoming translucent again, then vanishing entirely. Antonio immediately went to the yard and reviewed the truck's interior. Everything was as the duplicate had left it. Logbook filled out in his handwriting, fuel receipts in the console, even a half-eaten sandwich in the cooler matching exactly the type of sandwich Antonio always made for long drives. He researched similar phenomena and found scattered accounts, truckers reporting lost time, finding evidence of deliveries they didn't remember making, seeing themselves in places they shouldn't be. The accounts were typically dismissed as confusion, fatigue, or fraud, but Antonio knew he'd witnessed something genuine and terrifying. His life was being duplicated, his identity copied and deployed to drive his truck while he lived his normal life, unaware. The implications were staggering. How long had this been happening? Years, apparently, which meant thousands of miles, hundreds of deliveries had been completed by this duplicate Antonio, while the real Antonio was elsewhere. What was the duplicate? Where did it come from? Was it autonomous, or was some part of Antonio's consciousness being split, operating the truck while his body did other things? Antonio confronted his employer, showed them everything. They were disturbed but ultimately pragmatic. If deliveries are being completed, cargo is reaching destinations, and there are no accidents or incidents, is there actually a problem? Your performance metrics are excellent. You're one of our top drivers. The problem is I'm not doing half of those drives. Something else is, something that looks like me. But it is you, from every measurable perspective. It has your biometrics, your mannerisms, your decision-making patterns. Legally and practically, it's you. Antonio quit that company and tried working for others, but the phenomenon followed him. Whichever truck he was assigned, the duplicate would appear during his off hours, completing runs, maintaining perfect efficiency. It was as if something had learned to copy him, was using that copy to maximize his productivity, to turn him into an eternally working driver who never truly rested. He stopped trucking entirely, taking a warehouse job, a position where he could physically verify his presence and activities. But he wonders how many other truckers are experiencing the same thing. How many duplicates are driving America's highways, indistinguishable from the originals, completing deliveries while the real drivers live truncated lives, unaware that versions of themselves continue working even when they're sleeping, even when they're spending time with family, even when they think they're taking a break from the endless miles. Antonio Silva doesn't sleep well anymore. He dreams of driving, of highways that never end, of making deliveries in cities he's never visited. And he wakes up exhausted, as if he's actually been working all night. Maybe he has. Maybe the duplicate isn't just active during his off hours. Maybe it's always active, driving while he sleeps, operating in parallel. And the Antonio who thinks he's awake and living his life is just another duplicate, another copy. All of them fragments of a driver who was somehow split into multiple instances, each one convinced it's the original. Each one trapped in the act of endless driving, whether at the wheel or dreaming of it. Forever hauling cargo across America, unable to stop, unable to rest, because somewhere, always, an Antonio Silva is driving, and all of them are real. All of them are him, and none of them can ever truly stop. Story 7. The Bridge Between Nowhere. Thomas Brennan had been driving trucks for 34 years, longer than most drivers lasted in a profession that wore down bodies and minds with equal brutality. At 59 years old, Thomas was planning to retire within the year, looking forward to finally settling down with his wife in a small house they'd bought in Tennessee. But in September of 2023, Thomas drove across a bridge that shouldn't have existed. and the experience made him question whether he'd ever truly understood the geography of the country he'd been crossing for over 3 decades. Thomas was hauling automotive parts from Detroit to Little Rock, a route he'd driven at least 100 times during his career. The standard path followed Interstate 69 south through Indiana, and then cut west across Illinois and Missouri before dropping into Arkansas. Thomas knew every mile of this route, every town, every truck stop, every quirk of the road. He could have driven it blindfolded. But on this particular trip, in the early hours of a foggy September morning, Thomas encountered something that made him realize how little he actually knew about the highways he'd been traveling for decades. He was in southern Illinois, somewhere between Mount Vernon and the Kentucky border, driving through dense fog that reduced visibility to maybe 50 feet. The fog was thick enough that Thomas had slowed to 45 miles per hour, his hazard lights flashing, giving himself extra reaction time in case slower vehicles or obstacles appeared suddenly in the murk ahead. Around 3:30 in the morning, Thomas saw a sign emerge from the fog. Bridge ahead. Reduce speed. Standard highway signage. Nothing unusual. Thomas checked his mirrors. No traffic behind him, no vehicles visible anywhere in the fog. He was alone on the road, which wasn't surprising given the hour and the weather conditions. The bridge appeared gradually, materializing out of the fog like something from a dream. It was a steel truss bridge, old-style construction that reminded Thomas of bridges built in the 1930s and 40s. The bridge was narrow, just 2 lanes with no shoulders, the steel framework rising on either side like a tunnel of metal girders. Thomas couldn't see the far end through the fog, couldn't even estimate the bridge's length. What struck Thomas as odd was that he didn't remember any bridge at this location. He'd driven this stretch of highway dozens of times, and while there were several river crossings along the route, Thomas was certain none of them involved a narrow steel truss bridge. The bridges on this highway were modern concrete structures, wide and well-maintained, nothing like the ancient-looking span ahead of him. But Thomas was tired, it was foggy, and he'd been driving for 9 hours straight. Maybe he was misremembering the route, maybe this bridge had always been here and he'd simply never noticed it before, the way you could drive past the same landmark for years without consciously registering it. Thomas drove onto the bridge, his tires making a different sound on the metal grating of the roadway, a rhythmic humming that created an almost musical tone. The bridge's steel framework enclosed him on both sides, blocking any view of what the bridge crossed. Thomas couldn't see water or ground below, couldn't determine whether he was crossing a river, a valley, or something else. The bridge seemed to go on longer than any bridge Thomas remembered on this route. He'd been driving for what felt like several minutes at 45 miles per hour, which meant he'd covered at least 3 miles. But the bridge continued ahead, disappearing into fog, with no sign of the far end. Thomas checked his odometer, noting the reading, and continued forward. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At 45 miles per hour, Thomas had now driven approximately 7 miles on this bridge, and he still couldn't see the far end. That was impossible. There were no 7-mile-long bridges in southern Illinois. The longest bridge in the state was maybe 2 miles, spanning the Mississippi River. Thomas's unease deepened into genuine fear. He considered stopping, turning around, going back the way he came. But the bridge was only 2 lanes wide with no shoulder. There was nowhere to turn around, and backing up for 7 miles in dense fog seemed more dangerous than continuing forward. The fog inside the bridge's framework seemed denser than it had been on the approach, or perhaps the enclosed steel structure was trapping moisture and making visibility even worse. Thomas could barely see 20 feet ahead now. Just the steel girders on either side and the metal grating beneath his wheels. All of it suffused with gray fog that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Thomas grabbed his CB radio. "Breaker, breaker, this is Lone Star. Anyone out there copy? I'm on a bridge in southern Illinois and I need some information about this crossing. How long is this damn bridge? Static answered him. Thomas tried different channels, called out multiple times, but received no response. His CB was functioning. He could hear the carrier wave, could see the signal indicator lighting up when he transmitted, but no one was answering. Either there were no other drivers within range, or something about the bridge was blocking communication. Thomas checked his GPS. The screen showed him on Interstate 24, which was wrong. He should have been on I-69 or possibly I-57. The GPS couldn't seem to lock onto his position properly, the blue dot jumping erratically across the screen, sometimes showing him in Illinois, sometimes in Tennessee, sometimes in locations that made no geographical sense. 15 minutes on the bridge. Thomas had now driven over 11 miles at his current speed, and the bridge continued ahead with no variation, no change in structure, no indication he was approaching an end. The steel framework remained constant, the fog remained impenetrable, and the musical humming of his tires on the metal grating continued its hypnotic rhythm. Thomas's rational mind insisted this was impossible. Bridges didn't extend for 11 miles through fog without ending. He must be experiencing some kind of hallucination, some fugue state brought on by fatigue and the disorienting effects of the fog. Maybe he'd fallen asleep and was dreaming while his truck rolled forward on cruise control. But Thomas didn't feel asleep. He felt hyper-aware, every sense heightened by adrenaline and fear. He could feel the steering wheel under his hands, feel the vibration of the truck's engine, smell the diesel fuel and the metallic scent of the bridge's steel framework. This was real, whatever it was. 20 minutes, 15 miles of bridge if Thomas's calculations were correct. He was crossing something that shouldn't exist, traveling through a space that violated every rule of geography and engineering. Then Thomas noticed something that made his blood turn to ice. The steel framework on both sides of the bridge was changing. Subtly at first, but increasingly obvious as he continued forward. The girders were becoming older, more corroded, covered in rust and decay. Rivets were missing from joints. Entire sections of framework looked ready to collapse. The bridge was aging as Thomas drove across it, or he was traveling backward through time, seeing the bridge as it had been decades ago or would be decades in the future. The decay suggested the latter. He was seeing the bridge's future, watching it deteriorate toward inevitable collapse. Thomas pressed harder on the accelerator, increasing his speed to 60 miles per hour despite the fog and the dangerous conditions. He needed to get off this bridge before it decayed completely, before the structure failed and sent his truck plummeting into whatever abyss the bridge spanned. The steel framework continued to worsen. Rust covered everything now. Girders sagged visibly. Thomas could see cracks in the metal, stress fractures that suggested imminent failure. The musical humming of his tires had changed pitch, becoming discordant, almost like screaming metal. And then Thomas saw something through gaps in the framework that made him understand the true horror of his situation. Below the bridge, barely visible, through the fog and the gaps between girders, Thomas glimpsed what the bridge was crossing. It wasn't water. It wasn't land. It was nothing. Absolute emptiness, a void that had no bottom, no features, just infinite darkness extending in all directions. The bridge wasn't crossing a river or valley. It was crossing between realities, between locations that weren't geographically connected in normal space. Thomas was traveling through a liminal passage that connected two points that should have been impossible to connect. Driving across a bridge that existed outside normal geography. The realization came with a flood of understanding. This was why the bridge seemed endless. Because it wasn't traveling through normal three-dimensional space. It was taking a shortcut through some other dimension, some space between spaces, connecting distant locations through a passage that normal physics didn't allow. Thomas had driven onto a bridge between nowhere and nowhere, and he was trapped in the crossing until the bridge decided to release him, if it ever did. The steel framework was almost completely deteriorated now, more rust than metal, held together by forces that had nothing to do with structural integrity. Thomas could see through the framework to the void beyond, could feel his truck suspended over absolute nothingness by a bridge that defied every law of engineering. 30 minutes on the bridge, over 22 miles traveled at his current speed. Thomas's fuel gauge had dropped noticeably. He'd burned through at least 3 gallons of diesel crossing this impossible span. His truck was aging too, experiencing time and wear even as the bridge itself aged around him. Thomas prayed, something he hadn't done since childhood, asking whatever deity might listen to let him reach the end of this bridge, to let him return to normal roads in normal space where physics made sense and bridges had beginnings and ends. And then finally, after 35 minutes of crossing, Thomas saw light ahead. Not the gray fog he'd been driving through, but actual daylight, morning sun breaking through mist. The far end of the bridge was emerging from the fog, a concrete abutment that looked modern and solid and real. Thomas pressed his accelerator to the floor, his truck surging forward despite the load, racing toward that distant light. The decayed steel framework flashed past on both sides, rust and corrosion and structural failure held together by nothing but momentum and hope. Thomas's truck burst off the bridge onto solid concrete highway, the transition so abrupt it felt like breaking through a membrane. The steel framework disappeared behind him, swallowed by fog, and Thomas found himself on a normal highway with clear skies overhead and morning light illuminating familiar landscape. Thomas pulled onto the shoulder immediately and stopped, his whole body shaking. He climbed out of his cab and looked back at where he'd just emerged, expecting to see the bridge still there, still visible. But there was no bridge. Just normal highway stretching behind him. No fog, no steel framework, no indication that a bridge existed at this location. Thomas walked back along the shoulder, looking for the bridge approach, the abutment he'd just driven off of. Nothing. The highway was continuous concrete, no seams, no transitions, no evidence of a bridge crossing. Thomas checked his GPS. It showed him on Interstate 24 near Paducah, Kentucky. But that was impossible. Thomas had been on I-69 in Illinois when he'd entered the bridge. He'd driven approximately 25 miles across the bridge at an average of 45 miles per hour. But somehow he'd emerged over 200 miles southeast of where he'd entered, in a completely different state. The bridge had transported him across space as well as time. The 35 minutes he'd spent crossing had moved him 200 miles southeast, as if the bridge compressed distance, connected locations that should have required hours of normal driving. Thomas checked his truck's systems. The odometer showed he'd driven 27 miles since entering the bridge, the physical distance traveled across the span itself. But his GPS showed he'd moved 200 miles southeast from his previous position. The bridge's distance didn't correspond to actual geographical distance traveled. Thomas's fuel gauge confirmed he'd burned fuel equivalent to about 27 miles of driving, not 200 miles. The bridge had been real, had existed as a physical structure he'd crossed, but it had existed outside normal space, connecting distant points through some kind of spatial compression or dimensional shortcut. Thomas sat on the shoulder of I-24 for over an hour, trying to process what had happened. He'd entered a bridge in Illinois and exited in Kentucky, traveling 200 miles in 35 minutes by crossing a span that existed between normal locations, that connected points separated by vast distances through a passage outside conventional geography. Eventually, Thomas continued his journey, though he was now on a completely different route than he'd planned. He was already in Kentucky, halfway to Little Rock, despite having only driven since Detroit for what his logs showed as 10 hours. Not nearly enough time to cover the distance. When Thomas finally delivered his load in Little Rock, he was a full day ahead of schedule. The delivery supervisor was confused, checking Thomas's pickup timestamp from Detroit and calculating that Thomas couldn't possibly have made the trip in the time indicated. But Thomas's logs were accurate. His truck's electronic systems confirmed the timeline, and the cargo was delivered intact and on time, actually early by 24 hours. Thomas tried to report the bridge to his company, to highway authorities, to anyone who might investigate. But he couldn't provide a location. He didn't know where the bridge entrance was. It had simply appeared in fog on a route he'd driven hundreds of times. He couldn't mark it on a map, couldn't give coordinates, couldn't even confirm which highway he'd been on when he'd encountered it. Officials listened politely and concluded Thomas had become disoriented in the fog, had taken a wrong turn onto an alternate route that happened to be faster, and had simply misremembered or miscalculated his position. The idea that he'd crossed a bridge between nowhere that compressed space was dismissed as fatigue-induced confusion. But Thomas knew what he'd experienced. He'd driven across a bridge that existed outside normal geography, that connected distant locations through passages in space that shouldn't exist. The bridge was real. He'd spent 35 minutes crossing it, had burned fuel, had experienced the physical act of driving across steel frameworks suspended over a void. Over the following weeks, Thomas researched similar accounts. He found scattered reports from other drivers describing bridges that appeared in fog or darkness, bridges that seemed longer than they should be, bridges that deposited drivers in locations far from where they'd entered. The reports were dismissed as urban legends or hallucinations, but Thomas recognized the patterns. Other drivers had encountered similar passages, bridges between nowhere that compressed distance and connected distant points. Thomas theorized that these bridges were natural phenomena, or perhaps ancient infrastructure, passages that existed in spatial dimensions humans couldn't normally perceive. During certain conditions, fog, darkness, specific times, the passages became accessible, appearing as bridges that drivers could cross, transporting them across vast distances in minutes instead of hours. The passages were dangerous. Thomas had seen the deterioration, had witnessed the structural decay suggesting the bridges were failing, collapsing, becoming unstable. Crossing one was a gamble. You might emerge safely 200 miles from where you entered, or you might find yourself trapped on a deteriorating span suspended over void, with no way forward or back. Thomas Brennan retired from trucking 2 months after the bridge incident. He couldn't continue driving, couldn't trust that normal highways would remain normal, that familiar routes wouldn't suddenly open passages to places between nowhere. The experience had broken his confidence in the geographical stability of the world he'd been crossing for 34 years. Thomas spent his retirement researching the bridges, compiling accounts from other drivers, trying to map where the passages appeared and where they led. He created a database of reports looking for patterns that might predict when and where the bridges between nowhere became accessible. He found some patterns. The bridges appeared most frequently during fog or heavy rain, usually at night, usually on routes drivers had traveled many times before. They connected locations that were geographically distant but somehow related. Major transportation hubs, places where many routes converged. Locations with high volumes of traveler energy and intention. Thomas theorized that the bridges were like wormholes, shortcuts through space created by the collective intention of millions of travelers wishing to reach distant destinations quickly. The bridges manifested where enough desire and intention had accumulated, creating actual physical passages that compressed distance and allowed rapid travel between points. But the bridges were unstable, maintained by belief and use, deteriorating when travelers stopped believing in them or stopped crossing them. The decay Thomas had witnessed was the bridge beginning to fail. its structure held together by increasingly tenuous connections to reality. Thomas never crossed another bridge between nowhere. He retired, settled in Tennessee, and tried to live a normal life. But he couldn't forget those 35 minutes suspended over void, crossing impossible distance on a deteriorating span held together by forces beyond engineering, traveling through space that existed between normal locations, emerging in a different state 200 miles from where he'd entered. The bridge between nowhere taught Thomas that geography isn't as fixed as maps suggest, that distance is sometimes negotiable, and that the highways drivers cross every day sometimes intersect with passages that exist outside normal space, bridges between nowhere that connect distant points through dimensional shortcuts that compress hundreds of miles into spans of 27 miles, allowing drivers who enter them to travel faster and farther than physics should allow, crossing voids that have no bottom and emerging in locations they couldn't have reached in the time elapsed, delivered early to destinations they'd expected to reach days later, with memories of deteriorating steel framework and infinite darkness below, and the certain knowledge that they'd driven across something that shouldn't exist but did, a bridge between two nowheres that somehow connected everywhere. And Thomas wonders how many other drivers have crossed those bridges without realizing it, have driven through fog onto spans that compress distance, have emerged 200 miles from where they entered thinking they'd just lost track of time or gotten confused about their route, never understanding that they'd briefly left normal geography and traveled through passages between nowhere, crossing voids on bridges held together by collective intention and luck, driving through dimensions between dimensions, covering in minutes what should have taken hours, and arriving at destinations impossibly early with fuel burned and distance traveled that doesn't match the miles shown on GPS, living proof that the highways of America sometimes connect to roads that exist outside normal space, bridges that span between nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Passages that appear in fog for those unlucky or fortunate enough to encounter them and survive the crossing from one nowhere to another. Nowhere that somehow becomes exactly where you needed to be, delivered early and intact with only memories of steel framework deteriorating into rust and void stretching infinite below to prove the journey was real.